You have to try surprisingly hard to get kicked off a cruise ship. The threshold for bad behavior at sea is incredibly high, which makes the psychology of the people who actually manage to cross that line deeply fascinating. These are documented examples of what happens when passengers completely lose their grip on reality and earn themselves a one-way ticket home. 1. A 90,000-ton floating hotel contains hundreds of steel doors, and most sane people understand that the ones labeled crew only are restricted for a very good reason. But the concept of a fully prepaid vacation can trigger a bizarre cognitive shift in certain adults. Once a massive upfront payment is made, the boundary between temporary guest access and absolute property ownership completely dissolves in their minds. Kevin, a 45-year-old software developer from Austin, firmly believed that his premium balcony ticket granted him unhindered geographical rights to every single square inch of the vessel. During a 12-night Baltic sailing, Kevin decided that normal passenger activities like poolside trivia were meant for amateurs. His chosen vacation itinerary consisted of entirely unauthorized, self-guided tours of restricted operational zones. He didn't use force to break in. He merely possessed a terrifying level of confidence, a generic blue polo shirt he had purchased online before the trip, and a standard metal clipboard. On day 3, the executive chef turned around during the chaotic dinner rush to find Kevin standing quietly inside a secondary crew galley. Kevin, holding his clipboard and chewing on a dinner roll, calmly offered unsolicited advice on the resting time of the prime rib before security gently escorted him back to the passenger corridors. He was issued a stern, official warning. Unfortunately, Kevin viewed this warning not as a legal boundary, but as a thrilling challenge. He spent the next 4 days treating the ship's security protocols like a giant floating escape room. He was discovered in the underground crew mess hall, passionately attempting to buy cheap noodles from the staff vending machine using his guest keycard. The absolute peak of his exploratory entitlement occurred on day 8. The ship's head of housekeeping walked into the massive industrial laundry facility on Deck 2, a loud, sprawling, highly restricted workspace full of giant washing machines, and found Kevin standing at the end of a long metal table. He wasn't trying to steal uniforms or cause damage. He was actively operating a heavy-duty commercial towel folding machine, systematically feeding damp white pool towels into the rollers with absolute focus. When the frantic manager asked him what he was doing in a restricted industrial zone, Kevin explained with a completely straight face that he had been secretly observing the laundry staff through a cracked door, found their workflow highly inefficient, and generously decided to step in and optimize their folding rhythm. He was confined to his stateroom immediately, entirely cutting off his unauthorized internships, and escorted off the ship at the very next port in Sweden. As he was handed his lifetime ban paperwork on the pier, his only display of emotion was a deep, irritated sigh, followed by a formal request to have the ship's laundry director email him a letter of recommendation for his volunteer hours. 2. Entry 412 in the midnight security log of a newly launched European vessel noted a large rectangular white object tumbling silently through the darkness before splashing heavily into the Atlantic Ocean. The occupant of the balcony cabin responsible for the splash was a 32-year-old physical therapist named Greg, who was traveling with 3 loud friends on a prolonged bachelor party trip. Greg had spent the previous 4 hours at the schooner bar engaged in a heated, highly illogical debate about maritime physics, specifically asserting that modern cruise ship mattresses were legally required by maritime law to double as highly buoyant life rafts in the event of an emergency. When nobody in the bar agreed with his theory, Greg decided a practical, real-world demonstration was absolutely necessary. He returned to his cabin, stripped the fitted sheets, dragged the extremely heavy, premium memory foam block through the narrow glass balcony door, and heaved it over the railing into the abyss. He then stood on the balcony for 20 solid minutes with a pair of compact binoculars trying to spot whether it floated, completely ignoring the fact that it was pitch black outside and the ship was moving at 22 knots. The ship's environmental officers take intentionally throwing foreign objects into the sea as a strict, zero-tolerance offense. By 1:45 a.m., 3 security guards were standing inside Greg's cabin, staring blankly at a naked metal bed frame. Greg, still wearing his binoculars around his neck like a safari guide, calmly explained that he was conducting an independent safety audit and formally requested that the captain turn the vessel around so he could accurately log the results of his buoyancy experiment. He was immediately confined to his room, disembarked in Mexico at sunrise, slapped with a massive marine pollution fine, and permanently banned from the fleet. 3. Cruises offer a unique psychological blank slate. Psychologists frequently observe that when people are entirely surrounded by strangers hundreds of miles from home, they often fabricate completely new, grandiose identities because there is absolutely no one around to fact-check their reality. Gary, a 52-year-old insurance adjuster from Ohio, embraced this concept with terrifying dedication. He had originally booked the absolute cheapest windowless interior cabin on Deck 4, a room roughly the size of a standard walk-in closet. However, on the first afternoon of a Mediterranean sailing, while wandering the ship to see how the upper class lived, he noticed that the heavy oak door of a massive grand suite on Deck 10 was slightly ajar. A housekeeping cart was parked nearby, but the room was empty. Gary slipped inside just to look. He saw the panoramic ocean views, the marble soaking tub, and the wraparound balcony, and in that moment, Gary decided he simply didn't belong on Deck 4 anymore. Instead of leaving, he quietly locked the door from the inside and waited. When the steward eventually moved on, Gary began a highly calculated, stealthy migration. He couldn't just drag his heavy suitcase up 6 flights of stairs without looking suspicious. So, over the next 48 hours, he transported his entire wardrobe from Deck 4 to Deck 10, using a small, transparent plastic shopping bag, making roughly 20 separate trips. He meticulously unpacked his discount polo shirts into the cedar-lined walk-in closet. He arranged his cheap drugstore toothpaste next to the suite's complimentary luxury spa products. He even ironed his socks to make them look more expensive. Gary had essentially become a high-end maritime squatter. He learned the exact cleaning schedule of the Deck 10 housekeeping staff, slipping out to the buffet right before they arrived and returning exactly when they finished, confidently nodding at the crew as if he belonged there. He started wearing a plush white bathrobe on the balcony, enthusiastically waving at passengers on the dock. The illusion completely consumed him. By day 4, Gary's fabricated billionaire persona required an audience. He spent the evening at the ship's premium martini bar, loudly boasting about his immense wealth and his sprawling luxury suite. He eventually struck up a conversation with a distinguished, sharply dressed couple sitting in the corner. Gary, desperate to cement his high society status, insisted they abandon the crowded bar and join him in his private grand suite for an exclusive VIP nightcap. He used his slickest charm, led them into the glass elevator, confidently marched down the carpeted hallway of Deck 10, expertly jiggled the slightly broken door handle he had been exploiting, and welcomed them inside. He elegantly popped a bottle of complimentary champagne he found in the mini-fridge, gesturing broadly to the panoramic ocean view, bragging about how much he paid for the premium layout. The twist, however, arrived with the first sip of champagne. The sharply dressed older gentleman did not look impressed. He looked highly confused. He slowly placed his crystal flute on the marble coffee table, pulled a two-way radio from his tailored suit jacket, and locked eyes with Gary. The man was not a wealthy fellow passenger. He was the cruise line's regional vice president of hotel operations, currently on board conducting a secret, undercover corporate inspection. He calmly explained to a completely frozen Gary that this specific grand suite was officially listed in the system as entirely out of service due to a pending furniture audit, and no one was supposed to be inside, let alone a man serving stolen champagne. The VP had literally scheduled a maintenance walkthrough for that exact room the following morning. The absolute silence in the suite was deafening. Gary's glorious billionaire facade disintegrated in seconds. He was immediately escorted by 3 security officers back down to his actual cramped interior cabin on Deck 4 to pack his heavily transported wardrobe. He was permanently banned from the cruise line and dropped off at the port of Rome at sunrise. As he was handed his disembarkation papers, Gary didn't apologize. He merely adjusted his collar and asked the vice president if, hypothetically, his pouring technique had at least looked professional. 4. The culture of reserving pool loungers at the crack of dawn reveals exactly how quickly social etiquette collapses when people are competing for prime real estate. But Martin, a 42-year-old accountant, realized that simply placing a paperback book on a chair was an amateur strategy. Towels could be easily moved by the crew. Martin needed structural authority. He had boarded the Caribbean cruise with a large duffel bag containing 300 feet of bright yellow industrial caution tape and 6 collapsible, reflective orange traffic cones. On the second morning, while the ship was entirely asleep, Richard crept onto the main pool deck at 4:30 a.m. He didn't just reserve 2 chairs for himself and his wife. He cordoned off an entire premium section of the solarium. He meticulously placed the traffic cones in a large square, weaving the yellow caution tape between them to create an impenetrable barrier enclosing 12 of the best loungers facing the ocean. To finalize his territorial claim, he zip-tied a laminated sign to a handrail that read, "Private Platinum Tier Maintenance Zone. Do not cross." When the deck manager arrived at 7 a.m. and confronted Martin, who was proudly sitting in the center of his neon fortress sipping coffee, Martin absolutely refused to dismantle his creation. He argued with absolute sincerity that he was implementing a much-needed zoning system for the cruise line, and claimed that under obscure maritime salvage laws, he had successfully annexed that specific corner of the deck. He ended up actively wrestling a security guard for control of a traffic cone, which immediately resulted in him being locked in his cabin, permanently banned, and left on the dock in Jamaica with his plastic cones tucked tightly under his arm. 5. Have you ever been so absolutely certain you were right that you completely ignored reality staring you straight in the face? The massive cruise terminals in Nassau often dock up to 6 identical-looking megaships side by side, creating a maze of white steel that requires basic situational awareness to navigate. Psychologists note that vacationers frequently experience severe confirmation bias. Once their brain decides on a reality, they will completely ignore all physical evidence to the contrary. Eleanor, a 62-year-old retired florist from Denver, was absolutely certain she was boarding the correct vessel after a long day of day drinking in port. She wasn't. She had walked directly onto a competing European cruise line's ship. When her keycard flashed red at the gangway security scanner, she didn't pause to read the ship's logo printed literally everywhere. Instead, she threw a spectacular tantrum, loudly berating the security guard for the cheap magnetic strips on their cards, until the flustered officer, trying to clear a massive line of impatient passengers, simply checked her ID manually and waved her through, assuming the system was glitching. Eleanor confidently marched to Deck 8, successfully navigated to what she believed was her stateroom, and found the door propped open by housekeeping. She walked inside and stopped. The room was filled with someone else's luggage, foreign clothing, and several stuffed toys. Most people would immediately realize their catastrophic error. Eleanor concluded she was the victim of a highly coordinated maritime home invasion. She spent the next 15 minutes furiously dragging a couple's entire wardrobe, 3 heavy suitcases, and a set of expensive golf clubs out into the corridor, piling them up like a barricade. When the actual occupants, a bewildered Scottish couple, returned to find a strange American woman throwing their swimsuits into the hallway, Eleanor threatened to call the police on them for trespassing. The ship's chief security officer arrived, took one look at Eleanor's blue SeaPass card, and calmly informed her that she was not only in the wrong cabin, but entirely on the wrong cruise line, and her actual ship had departed for Miami 20 minutes ago. The twist came when Eleanor finally processed this information. She did not apologize to the Scottish family. She marched down to guest services, slammed her hands on the counter, and formally demanded that the captain of this ship immediately turn the vessel around and chase down her original ship so she could transfer via a rope ladder. When told that was impossible, she demanded a complimentary suite for the inconvenience of their security letting her on board. She was confined to a holding room, handed over to port authorities at the next stop, and permanently banned from sailing with the European line she hadn't even bought a ticket for. 6. What is it about free public space that makes people want to immediately claim it as their own private living room? The midship glass elevators on a modern cruise liner offer stunning panoramic views of the central promenade, but they are generally understood to be temporary transition spaces, not residential zoning. Julian, a 28-year-old graphic designer traveling solo, disagreed with this premise. On the 3rd evening of a crowded Bahamas sailing, Julian decided his windowless interior cabin felt entirely too claustrophobic, but he deeply resented the concept of paying for a balcony upgrade. His solution was an incredible display of spatial colonization. At roughly 2 a.m., Julian hauled a massive, heavy-duty nylon camping hammock and 2 industrial ratchet straps into elevator C. He strung the hammock diagonally across the glass cab, anchoring it securely to the stainless steel handrails. He then climbed inside with a pillow, a fleece blanket, and a tablet playing a movie, completely ignoring the fact that he was suspended inside a moving mechanical box. Whenever the brass doors slid open to reveal confused, late-night passengers, Julian didn't step aside. He remained horizontal, casually pausing his movie, and warmly offered them passage to their floor, occasionally asking them to duck under his suspension straps. Security was eventually dispatched after a frustrated casino manager noticed a man floating up and down past the promenade windows like a suspended caterpillar. When the guards stepped into the elevator on deck 12, Julian didn't even pack up. He simply smiled, handed them a printed room service menu, and politely asked if they could send a club sandwich to elevator C, currently hovering somewhere between decks 7 and 9. He was immediately unclipped, escorted back to his designated cabin, and slapped with a permanent corporate ban, though he spent the entire walk to the security office loudly complaining that the ship's actual beds lacked proper aerodynamic sway. 7. The physical confinement of a standard 170-square-foot cruise cabin can trigger a bizarre psychological reaction in adults who are used to sprawling suburban homes. Suddenly faced with highly restricted square footage, they develop an overwhelming claustrophobic urge to forcefully expand their territory, treating the ship's rigid steel architecture like a light suggestion. Brendan, a 50-year-old dental hygienist from suburban Atlanta, booked a basic balcony room on deck 8. He quickly decided the space was entirely too restrictive. Cruise ship balconies are separated by heavy metal privacy dividers, specifically designed to keep strangers from staring at each other while they sunbathe. These heavy partitions are strictly controlled by the cabin stewards using a specialized master key. Brendan, however, possessed a standard pocket multi-tool he had used to fix his luggage handle, and he deeply believed in the modern aesthetic of an open-concept floor plan. At 2 a.m. on the third night of a Mexican Riviera sailing, while the ship was entirely quiet, Brendan stepped onto his balcony and went to work. He didn't just pick the lock. He meticulously unscrewed the heavy steel hinges of the privacy divider, separating his balcony from cabin 8124. He quietly folded the massive metal panel back against the glass, effectively doubling his square footage by entirely annexing the balcony of complete strangers. He wasn't trying to steal from them. He simply wanted more morning sunlight and a wider angle for his vacation photos. He moved his small plastic table directly onto the dividing line, arranged his chairs to face the ocean, and went to sleep, profoundly satisfied with his unauthorized maritime renovation. The escalation occurred at 7:30 the next morning. The occupants of cabin 8124, a retired couple celebrating their 40th anniversary, opened their heavy blackout curtains to enjoy a private romantic ocean sunrise. Instead, they were greeted by the terrifying sight of a strange, middle-aged man sitting directly outside their glass door in a plush white bathrobe, casually sipping a mug of black coffee and reading a paperback thriller. When the terrified husband cracked the door open to demand what was going on, Brendan didn't flee or apologize. He offered a cheerful, neighborly wave, casually complimented the weather, and politely asked if they happened to have any spare cream for his coffee. He genuinely believed that by removing the steel wall, he had successfully initiated a friendly communal patio environment. The couple immediately barricaded their door and called emergency services. When 3 security guards sprinted onto the balcony, Brendan was highly offended by their frantic tone. He passionately argued that the shipyard's original compartmentalized design was terrible for ocean cross breezes, and he was simply optimizing the aerodynamics of Deck 8 for everyone's mutual benefit. He was permanently banned for a massive breach of passenger privacy, confined to his newly reduced room, and escorted off the ship at the next port, entirely baffled as to why his neighbors were so opposed to open-concept living. 8. You know that specific type of guy who refuses to ask for directions because he inherently distrusts anyone with a title? Put him on a floating vessel, and the results are spectacular. Navigation on a modern megaship relies on millions of dollars of advanced GPS technology, redundant satellite arrays, and highly trained maritime officers. Derek, a 44-year-old hardware store manager from Ohio, completely disregarded all of this because he possessed a $5 plastic compass he bought at a gas station. On the second day of a Western Caribbean itinerary, Derek stood on his balcony, staring intensely at the cheap plastic dial. What Derek failed to realize was that holding a magnetic compass directly next to a steel bulkhead while gripping a smartphone entirely ruins the calibration. His needle was pointing wildly toward the ship's smokestack. Derek concluded with absolute certainty that the captain was driving the vessel in the completely wrong direction. He didn't ask a crew member for clarification. He marched directly up to Deck 14, bypassed a clearly marked restricted barrier, and began forcefully pounding on the heavy steel security door of the navigational bridge. He was holding a rolled-up decorative pirate map he had purchased from the gift shop. When the first officer opened the door, entirely bewildered by the interruption, Derek unrolled his souvenir map, jabbed his finger at a drawing of a sea monster, and loudly declared that they were currently sailing toward international waters off the coast of Antarctica. The officer tried to gently explain the mechanics of magnetic interference on a steel ship, but Derek passionately argued that the crew was orchestrating a massive cover-up to save fuel. He attempted to physically step onto the bridge to take the helm and manually correct the course. Security intercepted him within seconds. He was permanently banned, locked in his stateroom, and disembarked at the next port, actively warning the dock workers that the ship was doomed to freeze. 9. The mandatory passenger safety briefing is a strict, internationally regulated legal requirement. The vessel legally cannot leave the dock until every single soul on board has checked in at their designated assembly station. However, for highly successful adults who are entirely unaccustomed to receiving direct orders, being told to stand in a quiet line by a 22-year-old crew member triggers a bizarre psychological regression. They instantly revert to the emotional maturity of a defiant toddler. Richard, a 53-year-old corporate vice president from Dallas, firmly believed that maritime safety protocols were designed exclusively for the lower loyalty tiers. On embarkation day of a 7-night Caribbean sailing, while 4,000 passengers dutifully gathered in dining rooms to listen to the alarm signals, Richard decided his time was simply too valuable to participate. He viewed the drill not as a life-saving measure, but as an optional, deeply annoying corporate seminar. To evade the crew members systematically checking empty cabins, Richard initiated a high-stakes game of maritime hide-and-seek. He slipped into the ship's massive, multi-deck main theater, which was entirely dark and deserted during the drill. Instead of simply sitting in the back row, which would have resulted in immediate discovery by the security sweep, Richard climbed directly onto the main stage. He spotted a massive, hollow fiberglass set piece, a decorative, oversized pirate treasure chest meant for the evening's musical production. Richard, wearing a pristine white linen suit, climbed inside the dusty chest, pulled the heavy curved lid completely shut, and sat in the pitch black. He genuinely thought he had outsmarted a multi-billion-dollar corporation. What Richard failed to grasp was that modern cruise lines use digital keycard scanners, meaning the bridge knew exactly who was missing. After 15 minutes, the captain halted the departure sequence and announced Richard's full name over the ship-wide public address system. Richard heard the booming announcement from inside his fiberglass box and actually chuckled to himself, stubbornly refusing to emerge. The ship sat paralyzed at the pier for a full 45 minutes. Security initiated a vessel-wide grid search. The illusion of his brilliant escape entirely shattered when a frantic stage manager, looking for a missing microphone cable, flipped on the theater's massive halogen work lights and opened the prop chest. He found a middle-aged executive sitting cross-legged in the dark, sweating profusely into his expensive linen collar. When escorted to the bridge by 3 unamused guards, Richard did not apologize for delaying the vacation of 4,000 people. He passionately argued that since he already knew how to buckle a life jacket from previous trips, his physical presence was redundant. He was escorted down the gangway before the ship even untied its mooring lines, permanently banned from the cruise line, leaving his luggage to be shipped back to Texas. 10. Tell me, why do people genuinely believe that spending a massive amount of money automatically makes them immune to basic social etiquette? There is a highly specific financial logic that some passengers apply to their vacation wardrobe. They convince themselves that the absolute monetary cost of an item directly translates to its level of formal elegance, completely regardless of its actual utility. Todd, a 40-year-old software engineer from Seattle, deeply despised the concept of packing a heavy tuxedo for the main dining room's formal night. Instead, he decided to utilize a loophole based entirely on his own imaginary financial metrics. At 6:30 p.m., Todd proudly marched up to the elegant crystal chandelier-lit entrance of the premium dining room wearing a 9mm professional-grade neoprene scuba diving wetsuit. It was not dry. He had just returned from a snorkeling excursion, and the thick black rubber was actively weeping seawater onto the ornate floral carpet. When the horrified maitre d' immediately stepped forward and physically blocked the entrance, Todd was entirely prepared for a debate. He calmly crossed his thick rubber arms and delivered his defense. He argued that the dress code simply requested elegant evening attire, and since his custom-fitted thermal wetsuit retailed for over $1,500, making it statistically more expensive than the cheap, rented polyester suits worn by the other guests, he was actually the best-dressed man in the room. He completely ignored the fact that he was leaving a growing, highly slippery saltwater puddle in the lobby. When the manager firmly denied his entry, Todd stubbornly bypassed the podium and sat at a nearby empty table. The auditory result was a high-pitched squeal as the wet rubber rubbed against the polished mahogany chair. He was promptly removed by security, permanently banned from all specialty dining venues, and forced to eat his formal lobster dinner sitting on a plastic chair at the pool buffet, gently squeaking every time he reached for the butter. 11. The daily printed newsletter is the absolute psychological anchor of a cruise vacation. When passengers lose their cellular service and their normal daily routines, they treat the ship's schedule like an infallible religious text. If the paper says there is a trivia contest at noon, they will be there at 11:45. Margaret, a 64-year-old retired municipal event coordinator from Ohio, understood this blind compliance perfectly. On a 14-night transatlantic crossing, Margaret decided that the official cruise director was entirely incompetent, and the scheduled entertainment was unforgivably boring. Rather than filing a complaint, she initiated a highly sophisticated, unauthorized hostile takeover of the ship's entire social calendar. Margaret visited the ship's library, logged into the public computer workstations, and spent 6 hours meticulously recreating the exact graphic design, fonts, and layout of the official daily newsletter. Once she perfected the template, Margaret began inventing her own highly appealing, completely fabricated events. She scheduled a complimentary Rolex appreciation hour at the high-end jewelry boutique. She listed a captain's open bar and Q&A taking place in the atrium at exactly 4 p.m. She even created a diamond tier-only lobster tasting at a specialty restaurant that was usually closed for lunch. Using her onboard credit, she paid the internet cafe to print 400 full-color copies of her forged itinerary. At 3 a.m., while the corridors were silent, Margaret walked deck after deck, slipping her fake schedules under the doors of the most expensive suites and premium balcony cabins. The results the next morning were completely chaotic. At exactly 10 a.m., a massive crowd of highly demanding, wealthy passengers descended upon the tiny jewelry store, demanding their free luxury watches. The bewildered retail staff had to physically lock the glass doors and hide near the registers. At 4 p.m., over 300 thirsty guests swarmed the central atrium, chanting for the captain to appear and serve them free martinis. The cruise director was completely panicked, running around with a megaphone trying to explain that the schedule in their hands was a forgery. Security eventually checked the computer lounge's print logs and traced the massive ink usage directly to Margaret's SeaPass card. But the true twist came when they finally apprehended her on Deck 5. They found Margaret sitting at a small plastic folding table she had dragged out of the card room, positioned strategically near the entrance to the main dining room. She wasn't just distributing fake schedules for her own amusement. She was running a highly lucrative, entirely imaginary VIP concierge service. Margaret had printed realistic-looking Fast Pass lanyards at the computer lounge and was actively selling them to confused passengers for $50 cash, promising them priority seating at the non-existent captain's open bar and guaranteed front-row seats for a fabricated midnight comedy show. She had essentially invented a completely fake economy based on events that would never happen, and perfectly rational adults were blindly handing her money because she wore a generic blue blazer, held a clipboard, and spoke with absolute, unwavering authority. When the chief security officer confiscated her lockbox full of cash and her stack of forged schedules, Margaret did not show an ounce of remorse. She crossed her arms, glared at the officer, and passionately argued that her fabricated events had generated significantly more foot traffic in one single day than the official entertainment staff had achieved all week. She genuinely believed she was entitled to a percentage of the bar revenue for her marketing efforts. She was immediately confined to her cabin. Her entire counterfeit operation was dismantled, and she was permanently banned from the cruise line, disembarked in Portugal with nothing but her blue blazer and a stern warning from local port authorities regarding maritime fraud. The ship is just a psychological mirror. Remove daily consequences, and people quickly show you who they really are. I have to know, what would you do if you woke up to a guy in a bathrobe who just unscrewed your balcony divider? Call security or offer him coffee? Tell me below. Subscribe if you want more deeply researched case studies on the bizarre reality of human behavior at sea.